everyone, and welcome to our fifth edition of the Experiential Science Talk series. The Center of Excellence in Youth Mental Health has put on this series, which showcases experts with lived experience, and they're invited to come to share their knowledge as well as provide some new and exciting directions in youth mental health research. So for our fifth talk, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Chelsea Cuffaro. Chelsea is a dedicated mental health advocate who strives to amplify the voices of those who are often misunderstood or struggle in silence. Her ability to deeply connect with others and meet them where they are in their journey arises from her own lived experience. So for nearly the past year, Chelsea has served as the lived experience coordinator at the Center of Excellence in Youth Mental Health, where she leads our youth and family councils and as well as other lived experience initiatives. During her time at the CEYMH, she's put together a large body of knowledge on best practices and guidelines on how to involve lived experience in research. She is also a graduate student in the Counselling Psychology program at McGill University, which she starts this week. And she aspires to be a clinician-researcher in the future, where she'll hopefully address the systematic barriers to accessing care and the unmet needs of youth. So we're very fortunate to have Chelsea's energy and creativity on our team and to have her continue to be with us as she pursues her studies. So today's talk, we will be discussing the stigma and misconceptions associated to her own lived experience. And we'll also be offering some lines of thought for future work and considerations. So after the lecture, there'll be a Q&A/discussion period where people are invited to share their thoughts. So please note that the seminar itself will be in English. It'll be recorded, but questions at the end can be asked in both official languages. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Chelsea.
Thank you, Kristen, for that great introduction. So I'm happy to be here in front of all of you as part of the CEYMH Experiential Talk series. And so today I'll be talking a little bit about my lived experience, and it might resonate with some things you know or have experienced in the past. However, I do want to emphasize that this is my own experience and might not be generalizable to everyone. With that in mind, I realize that we all walk through that door today, maybe with assumptions or biases about BPD, but I hope we can leave all of that at the door and start this presentation with a fresh slate and an open mind. As I share some vulnerable moments of my life with you all, I want to quickly note that I will be discussing topics around suicide and self-harm. And although I hope to discuss this in a safe way, I understand that it may be distressing for some. And so if you need to take a step away from the presentation, please do so, and I totally understand. So to sort of get everyone on the same playing field, I like to provide an analogy that really helped my support system when understanding what I was experiencing. Now, imagine you have a third-degree burn and you have things that get close to you, touch you, or even a whiff of air. Imagine how overwhelmingly intense and painful that might be. That's how it is for people who live with BPD. It's like they have a third-degree burn, but for emotions. Individuals who struggle with BPD often lack emotional skin, and as a result, even the slightest movement or touch can be excruciatingly painful. Now, as I provide this analogy, I'd like to move into a little bit of storytelling of my lived experience of borderline personality disorder. I always struggled with mental health as a kid and as a 4-year-old actually, and then as a teenager and then as a young adult. There was a really big turn during June of 2016 when my mental health started to take a turn for the worst, and my parents started noticing symptoms that were sort of outside of my usual anxiety and depression that I was struggling with during high school. And I became more and more unstable in terms of my mood, the volatility in my mood changes. I started to struggle more and more with thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore. And this started to happen during my transition from graduating high school to CEYMH. I moved from a moment in life when I had stability and friends around me to a moment where I went to a school where none of my friends were present, and I was in this new environment, which caused a lot of instability. And I think provided sort of the downfall of what was the next couple of years in terms of my mental health. During this time in my first year of CEYMH, I was struggling a lot with trying to figure out what it is I wanted to pursue in life, but also with a lot of dark thoughts, feeling lost, alone, confused, and as if I didn't really have purpose in what in this world today, but back then. And so what happened was I started engaging in self-harm behaviors to sort of deal with these overwhelming emotions and feelings that I was dealing with, to sort of, what was for me, to feel something other than just intense emotional pain. And to also cope with my emotions in a way that might have been maladaptive, was maladaptive. And I always struggled with suicide, even suicidal tendencies, even as a young adult. As young as 13, I opened up to my mom in a car ride where I asked her if having such thoughts was normal at such a young age. And my mom, being the rock that she was, kind of normalized in the fact that everybody kind of struggles with these thoughts sometimes, and that if I continued to feel this way, that she was there and that we would get me the help that I needed. And that really established a foundation of trust with my mom, who, as I continue to tell this story, apart, not only her, but my whole support system has really played a critical role in my recovery, which I hope to talk about right now. So the critical point in my journey was when I had visited an emergency room too many times to count on one hand, and my mom sort of gave up and didn't know what to do anymore. So I ended up here at the Douglas in the emergency room with my mom, who helped guide me and allowed me to feel that this was a safe place to talk about what I was struggling with. And at the time, I felt like I was overrun by my BPD. I didn't feel like I could regulate my emotions. I had severe fear of abandonment. I had impulsivity. I engaged in suicidal tendencies and self-harm. And so my mom really reached her breaking point, in a point where I was no longer getting the help that I needed, and it was impossible to receive any sort of clarity. And so we came to the Douglas, where I was assessed and diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. That was a real turning point for me, because it gave me clarity on at least a label of what I was struggling with. And it gave me something to search online on, like, kind of normalizing what it was that I was feeling. And they also provided me with a therapist, because I was in critical condition at that time. Unfortunately, the wait lists that were at the Douglas program were too long. And so I was referred to a therapist outside, because we had the ability to pay for it. And that's when I started dialectical behavior therapy. However, we know that there's a lot of instability with BPD, and there's moments of crises that happen often. And so that wasn't my last visit to the emergency room. And in April of 2018, I made a serious attempt to take my life. And at this point, I was institutionalized at the hospital in Laval. Yet I'll also discuss a little bit today how that's often not the first line of treatment for people with BPD. I felt like I was thrusted out of my routine, out of my safe space, and it made it even harder for me to regulate my emotions at this time. My mom listened to me and pulled me out within 48 hours. So that was a real turning point during that time. I made a vow to myself, my parents, and my therapist at the time that I wouldn't do this anymore. I wouldn't engage in this type of behavior. And that's a big promise for someone who used it as a coping mechanism. However, I started to take this point to turn it into a story of recovery, and that I wanted to be a voice for other people, because I felt so alone online and so alone in a world that never talked about BPD in a positive way, or in a way that made me feel seen and understood. So I started to talk about my experience online, and I started to volunteer with a mental health organization, jack.org, that really gave me a voice, that gave me a platform to go into schools and communities, not only to talk about mental health, but to talk about my struggles with BPD and with suicide. And so in August of 2019 is when I really started to see, and you could see it in the pictures here, there was a real change in how I started to discover myself. And I started to feel, who was Chelsea? What was Chelsea like outside of her BPD, outside of that label? And so I dyed my hair black, I got a nose piercing, I started to make new friends. And I really felt like I found this version of myself that I was content with. And I was content being alone with myself. And then the pandemic hit. And although that typically caused a lot of distress for a lot of people, it actually encouraged me and thrusted me into a whole new discovery of my recovery, and allowed me to spend time alone with myself, which, when I was in the deep dark pits of my struggles didn't happen. I would always cope with hanging out with everybody else or doing things to keep myself busy. And during the pandemic, I really figured out like who Chelsea is, what she loves. And I started to discover that recovery was going to be possible and there would be a life that I would find that was worth living. And so in May in 2021, I worked and kind of produced a documentary with Jack.org on my struggle with BPD and on my journey and the stigma that I faced, because I think it's really important. And I didn't really dig into that into my story, but I will later in this presentation to talk about the stigma that exists and how I was refused care several times simply because of the diagnosis I had received. And so I made this documentary and I released it into the world, which was very, very vulnerable for me because anybody can access this on YouTube. And so it puts me in a forefront that sometimes doesn't feel real. But it was really the point in a point in time where I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. I saw that recovery was possible, that everybody who told me I was treatment resistant and that I would never recover, well, I was kind of like, well, here I am to prove you wrong. And here's a video to actually prove you wrong, that recovery is possible. And then in a million years, I would have never thought that in June of 2024, I would graduate with a bachelor's degree and an honors bachelor's degree in psychology. 19-year-old Chelsea would have never imagined this for herself, never imagined standing up here talking in front of all of you. And so I really, really hope that just talking about mental health in general and BPD today really inspires the hope that recovery is possible and that maybe we can move towards a discourse that talks about BPD somehow like we talk about anxiety and depression and just normalize it a little bit more. So that's a little bit about my story to give you guys context. And so I want to jump into how borderline was originally described. And it was originally intended to describe a group of individuals whose pathology lied on the border between neurosis and psychosis. However, that term is outdated and misrepresentative. Traditionally, in psychiatry, when we talk about BPD, we refer to the DSM-5, which characterizes it as a pervasive pattern of instability, of interpersonal relationships, self-image and affects, marked impulsivity that usually begins by early adulthood and is present in a variety of contexts, as indicated by 5 or more of a set of 9 criteria. In comparison, more recent research has suggested that the defining features of BPD are best characterized by traits such as emotion dysregulation, relational dysfunction, often referred to as relational disturbance or instability, and impulsivity. In this context, we can say that people who live with B can actually be instead described as a group of individuals who are unstable emotionally and interpersonally. Regardless of how we define it though, BPD is a severe and life-threatening mental health disorder that has onset in late adolescence to early adulthood and affects around 5.4% of Canadians. Approximately 90% of those engage in suicidal and self-injurious behavior, and around 8 to 10% die by suicide. I previously mentioned that to get a diagnosis with BPD, you need to meet 5 or more of the 9 criteria, which are presented here. As you can imagine, if you only need to meet 5 out of 9 criteria, there must be a great heterogeneity of symptoms and thus a wide range of possible presentations of the disorder. That, coupled with the fact that people with BPD also have comorbid mental health disorders, leaves for an even wider presentation of symptoms. Therefore, my experience might be incredibly different and unique than another person living with BPD. Now let's talk about one of my favorite people, Marsha Linehan, the founder of dialectical behavior therapy, the main form of treatment for BPD. She describes BPD as an emotion dysregulation disorder. Emotion dysregulation briefly is defined as the inability to effectively regulate one's emotions. According to Linehan's biosocial theory, which I'll get into in a second, BPD arises from the interaction between invalidating environments and biologically emotionally vulnerable children. So let's start with the biosocial theory and specifically the invalidating environments that tend to dismiss or trivialize a person's emotional experiences. They do this in 2 ways: by telling the person they're wrong about their feelings or what causes them. For example, hearing, "You're the only one feeling like this, stop crying." And by linking their emotions to negative traits. "Stop crying, you're being a drama queen," some might say. This environment prevents children from learning how to identify and manage their emotions, and they instead learn how to fluctuate between inhibiting their emotions and extreme emotional experiences. which was the case for myself. The individual in the transactional model is said to be biologically emotionally vulnerable. This emotional vulnerability is characterized by high sensitivity to emotional experiences, which means that they therefore have a low threshold for emotional stimuli, intense emotional reactivity, and a slow return to baseline. What that all means is that we tend to react more intensely to an emotional experience, and therefore it takes us longer to calm down, which was the case for myself since a very young age. That was initially characterized by anxiety and then later developed into BPD. Together, the child's emotional vulnerability and the invalidating environment create a cycle where intense emotional responses reinforce the invalidation, making the child's feelings seem unwarranted. This cycle worsens the emotional reactivity and hinders the development of emotion regulation skills, leading to the formation and persistence of BPD traits. It can also be argued that the lack of emotional skin that I explained early on is a result of this increased sensitivity to emotional experiences, intense emotions, and a slow return to baseline. So you can imagine if you had a third-degree burn, you would react intensely to a slightest touch, and then it would probably take you a couple more minutes to calm down than it would somebody else that just simply touched their hand. So this analogy really provides a little perspective of what it feels like to have those intense emotions. Initially, the goal of this presentation was to provide evidence that emotion dysregulation is core to BPD, and thus a more fitting and less stigmatizing term would be emotion regulation disorder. Although I still think this is fitting based on my personal experience, I did do a more recent review of the literature and found that findings regarding ED, emotion dysregulation as core to BPD might be mixed. First, I'll present the evidence for emotion dysregulation as core to BPD. Several of the DSM criteria for BPD have strong ties to emotion dysregulation, specifically impulsive behaviors, identity struggles, and unstable interpersonal relationships. Impulsive, self-injurious, and suicidal behavior and engaging in self-harm is a harsh reality for people who live with BPD. Linehan suggests that suicide and impulsive behaviors characteristic of BPD are a maladaptive response to coping with the overwhelmingly unmanageable and deeply painful negative emotions. A recent study by Merkovic and colleagues found that suicide attempts in adolescents living with BPD is mediated by emotion dysregulation. Glenn and Klonsky also found that struggles with emotion dysregulation show a unique relationship with the BPD, specifically emotion dysregulation due to impulsive behaviors and maladaptive coping strategies. Another core aspect of BPD is identity struggles. Emotion dysregulation also contributes to identity disturbance, which is one of the 9 criteria. Identity, as we all imagine, typically develops through consistency or finding a passion or exploring preferences. However, according to Linehan, she says that the emotional instability in BPD leads to unstable behavior and cognitive inconsistency, which ultimately prevents a sense of identity or a stable sense of self from developing. A recent review of the literature on identity pathology and BPD hypothesized that chronic invalidation may not only lead to emotion dysregulation, but also cause youth to mistrust their own judgments, develop negative self-perceptions, and discourage them from building mastery in potentially rewarding areas. Despite this review also found that the construct of identity is poorly understood relative to other core BPD features. Coming from lived experience, I often felt, especially throughout my time in CEYMH, that I didn't know what I wanted to do because I didn't feel like I had any stability in my life, and I didn't have the opportunity to discover what my preferences were because of the emotional pain that I was experiencing. Finally, unstable and intense interpersonal relationships are a characteristic of BPD. Research has shown that emotion dysregulation seems to be an underlying factor to the development of such chaotic relationships. You can imagine that being able to regulate your emotions, reduce impulsivity, and sometimes endure painful experiences are in some ways fundamental to a healthy relationship. As people who live with BPD often lack these skills, it does kind of make sense that intense and unstable personal relationships form. So As someone who lived with BPD, I felt as though emotion dysregulation was central to most of my struggles and symptoms. As I spent more years in therapy and I started my journey to recovery, I came to realize that if I didn't have the capacity to regulate my emotions that day, so the way I give this analogy is pretend there's a switch that you have to turn on every day in your brain to regulate your emotions. I need to sleep, eat, and take care of myself to be able to turn on that switch and regulate my emotions every day. If I didn't have that capacity, I didn't sleep well or I didn't eat well the day before, I tend to have an incapacity to regulate my emotions and be a fully functioning human. Then my BPD voice would be amplified. So all of these experiences led me to read literature that supported what I was feeling. Although, as I've joined the world in research, I understand the importance of seeing opposing findings. Fitzpatrick and colleagues identified a gap, being that there's no unifying paradigm that tests all of the main emotion dysregulation components and comprehensively examines whether BPD is an emotion dysregulation disorder, and if so, in what ways. So she proposed a unified paradigm that assessed whether BPD is characterized by emotion dysregulation components compared to a GAD group and healthy controls. She found that individuals with BPD and GAD exhibited higher self-reported and sympathetic baseline emotions compared to healthy controls. The BPD group also exhibited self-reported emotion regulation deficits using only distraction. And I'll explain this in a little bit, compared to the GAD group. She thus concluded that there's limited evidence for components of emotion dysregulation in BPD, and that those that were present seem to be widespread across groups with high emotion dysregulation, such as those with GAD, rather than being specific to BPD. Essentially, what she had found was that when people with BPD struggle with emotion regulation specific to distraction, is that we tend to ruminate on our emotions. So it'll take a longer time to regulate because we'll hyper focus on the emotion that we're experiencing and thus not be able to distract and regulate through that skill. And to me, when I read this, it kind of did make sense because as somebody with comorbid anxiety, regulating my anxiety was also hard if I didn't regulate my emotions. So I felt like the two were kind of interlinked, but it's still a little unclear and there is more research that needs to be done on exploring whether emotion dysregulation is core to BPD. I'd like to shift into talking about the narrative on the stigma surrounding BPD. Manipulative, explosive, difficult to treat, attention-seeking, needy, and treatment-resistant are just some of the pejorative terms I've been labeled as during my time in care. These terms associated with BPD relate to the common practice of treatment refusal and being labeled as untreatable. It also leads to consequences such as dislike, distancing by others, social inclusion, symptom exacerbation, and wariness among healthcare providers. People who live with BPD are often told that they're attention-seeking or manipulative, especially when they engage in suicidal or self-harm behaviors, which are often cries for help rooted in intense emotional pain. In reality, these behaviors are driven by emotion dysregulation and past experiences in invalidating environments, not intentional manipulation. The fluctuating symptoms of BPD are often beyond the individual's control, influenced by factors such as emotional instability. In addition, BPD symptoms such as self-injury and frantic efforts to avoid abandonment are often interpreted as attention-seeking. The research actually shows that these behaviors are probably driven by attempts to regulate emotions or cope with the invalidating environments. Again, this stigma within clinical and research setting often leads to the practice of treatment refusal. And evidence from the literature supports these findings. Kling shared her lived experience in an academic article that she had with the healthcare system, where she often had therapists refuse treatment due to having a BPD diagnosis, as she would be too difficult to treat. Sulzer also found similar results among clinicians, where clients with a BPD diagnosis would often hear, "Sorry, no can do," and the term difficult was used as a code word among clinicians to support the dismissal of clients. Sulzer goes on to explain how, despite being one of the most suicidal patient groups, the difficult to treat discourse is further supported by the idea that suicidal is equivalent to manipulative. When talking about the stigma and BPD, we can't forget about how BPD is portrayed in the media. Like most representations of mental illness in the media, the problem with the BPD depictions we see on TV is that they fail to consider the totality of the character's lived experience. Oftentimes, it's an incomplete and stigmatized view of the person. Writers will rarely consult people with lived experience to ensure accuracy and to develop a full understanding of BPD's challenges, something that often occurs in research as well. The reality is that characters with BPD are often portrayed as violent and destructive. One recent example that most of you might be aware of is the Heard v. Depp trials. There were tweets and articles characterizing people with BPD as toxic, manipulative, or abusive, and many worried that the diagnosis would become a term to describe people who are violent. Yet we know the reality is that they're more likely to engage in self-harm than violence against others. As someone living with BPD during the time that this was happening in the media, I felt like I didn't have a voice. I felt like I was powerless, and I felt like anything I say wouldn't change the narrative regarding BPD because this kind of overtook the media. And so I worked really hard to change the narrative and to move and to try to open up and talk about it online and engage in conversations that really help people shift their perspective. Overall, accurate representations of people with BPD in the media can only be accomplished by involving people with lived experience and demonstrate the true complexities of living with BPD. Perhaps changing the diagnosis to emotion regulation disorder would be more accurately representative of the realities of those living with BPD and hopefully change the narrative. So how have I done some work to change the narrative? The main thing that I did was start working with JAC.org to talk about mental health in general. And then I used this platform to help create a documentary, as part of their Untold series, talking about my mental health, the barriers I faced when accessing care, specifically accessing care for BPD, how I was refused treatment, the things that I heard by different therapists, medication, and so on and so forth. And that really served as a sounding board for a lot of people to come into my life and to ask me questions about BPD and start the conversation and really say that the documentary changed their perspective. And I think that's the whole point, is to include lived experience to start changing this narrative around any type of mental health disorder so that we can actually understand the realities of what people are living with. And then more recently, I've started to engage in a lot of advocacy work with the Douglas Foundation. I recently worked on a commercial with them that'll be coming out in October. And I got to share my story and how the Douglas was actually a really pivotal point in my recovery journey for providing me with a diagnosis and access to somebody who would provide the treatment that saved my life. And then this continues on and fills into my role as the lived experience coordinator at the CEYMH, where I get to center my lived experience and amplify the voices of other people with lived experience and their interest in mental health and make sure that they're heard, understood, and that their voices are taken seriously. So I'd like to conclude this presentation to discuss some general recommendations, some of which are based on research and others my personal lived experience. First, generally, and I hope this has become a little bit more clear throughout my presentation, is that we need to be mindful of the language we use when discussing BPD. Avoid language that takes a judgmental approach to labeling behavior. If we go back to the example of being labeled as manipulative, we know there's substantial evidence that disproves this. I also think we need to be more mindful of using recovery-oriented language in general when talking about mental health, but also when talking about BPD. As someone with lived experience, I was always told I would never recover and that this was something I would live with for the rest of my life. And although it is something I will take with me for the rest of my life, it's something that I'm in recovery of. And I think I am proof that that's far from the truth. Second, I'd like to see collaborations with people who have high levels of experience with working with BPD, as well as lived experience experts. This doesn't only apply to research, but also in the development of policies and approaches as well. This could be to help craft language guidelines, screen policies for sensitivity, and suggest research areas to spotlight, some of which is the work that I've started to do in my role as a lived experience coordinator. Also, the BPD community is large and diverse, and we need to consult multiple voices, not just one, because as I mentioned, you could have a plethora of different presentations of someone with BPD, so it's important to engage multiple voices. Third, researchers and professors who work with trainees at any level, whether that be undergrad, grad, interns, residents, or fellows, should avoid perpetuating the biases about BPD, and clinical researchers should ensure that training includes accurate information about BPD. as an undergrad in one of my first year psychology classes on psychopathology. When the professor presented the topic of BPD, they said clinicians should avoid working with people with BPD because they were manipulative, destructive, difficult to treat, and would never respond to treatment. I think that speaks to the discourse that we need to change at the level of just undergrad. Next, I think there needs to be an increase in funding to support BPD research. A recent article published in February 2024 found that BPD research received fewer funded grants from CEYMH than bipolar disorder and psychosis research across 23 years of funding. Although this might not totally mean that BPD research is underfunded per se, it might just mean that they're undersought. And so due to the stigma and the discourse that exists, researchers might not want to seek out working with people with BPD. So it's not always possible to increase funding and to seek out working on BPD. I still believe that it's something that can be worked towards and a field that I hope to one day contribute to. In terms of pharmacological treatment of BPD, we know there's no one medication that's used to treat BPD like many other disorders. I'd like to speak to a little bit of what worked for me in my treatment using medication. What truly worked for me was having a psychiatrist who listened to me as a patient and my experience. So she worked on treating my most distressing symptom, which for me at the time and still now is mood instability and emotion regulation of my mood instability, and not the comorbidities that I was struggling. So initially we treated me with antidepressants and anti-anxieties because I was struggling with depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms. What happened was I was numbed out by the antidepressants, and I wasn't feeling the intense emotions that I was used to feeling. When I wanted to cry, I couldn't cry. When I wanted to feel overjoyed, I couldn't feel overjoyed. And so I communicated this to my psychiatrist and worked on identifying, okay, well, antidepressants don't work, anti-anxiety don't work. So what is gonna work? And so we worked on a low dose of an antipsychotic that helps me live my day-to-day life and be able to regulate every day. This wouldn't have happened if I didn't feel like I had an open line of communication with my psychiatrist who took me seriously and my symptoms that I was expressing seriously. So I think what I hope to see is that we focus on understanding why the patient feels like the medication isn't working for them, rather than first starting off the conversation with why it might not be working. So listen to that. Why do you feel like this medication is working? How can I help? And then at the end of this, you could explain why it might not be working and then reevaluate that with the patient. That's kind of my perspective, but that's just on my lived experience. I'd also like to see psychoeducation on BPD and the fact that it's treatable and recovery is possible. And so this could look like workshops for clinicians, researchers, healthcare workers, and people with lived experience that are led by researchers and clinicians that have expertise in these areas, but also have lived experience experts on these panels that work on creating these workshops. And so this will be to further destigmatize the disorder, but also provide empirical and experiential knowledge that changes the discourse. Finally, from personal experience, my main recommendation for future research directions would be focusing on reducing the barriers to care. Now that's a big ask. I think the first thing to talk about is how we know that people with BPD heavily utilize emergency services due to their maladaptive coping strategies in moments of extreme emotional distress. What if we focused on ways to improve access to services for people with BPD starting in emergency rooms? So does that look like having a specialist with BPD that'll reassure the patient that they're going to have quick access to care, which I think is something we're working on here at the Douglas, is continuous care across the youth continuum. But how do we reduce the number of emergency room visits? Is there a way that we can sort of do this in a systematic way? So those are my recommendations for future research based on some research that I did, but also my personal lived experience. And so if you had a physical third-degree burn, you would be treated with immediate urgency and care. I think it's about time that those living with third-degree burns for emotions are treated with that same care and urgency. 6 years ago, I was hospitalized because I made a serious attempt to take my life. I truly did not think life was worth living and felt lost, alone, and controlled by my BPD. Through the support, care, and understanding from family, friends, and a great therapist, I have finally found a life worth living. 19-year-old Chelsea would be very proud of herself for being up here in front of you presenting, let alone believe that she would have graduated with great distinction and pursuing graduate studies. Oh, how I wish I could tell younger Chelsea just the amazing things she would get up to. I also hope this presentation encouraged a change in the discourse on BPD. perhaps even renaming the disorder altogether, and that it provided proof that people with BPD are treatable, can recover, and ultimately live fulfilling lives. I'd like to end this presentation by thanking you all for being here and spending a few minutes of your day with me. It truly does mean the world. I would also like to sincerely thank everyone at the CEYMH for their help, patience, and feedback as I prepared this presentation. I'd also like to thank them for believing in me, my story, and the power of lived experience, and I can't wait to continue to achieve great things with them. Also, a little special thank you to my support system, as I'd likely not be up here in front of all of you without them. Thank you. And if you're interested in watching the documentary, there's a QR code here, my contact information if you ever wanted to connect. And then if you're ever interested in our advisory councils or working on lived experience initiatives, there's the form that's on this website where you can reach out to me as well.
Thank you so much, Chelsea, for sharing that. So we have a few comments just saying great job in the chat. We will open up the floor for questions or discussions or areas of clarity. So for people on Zoom, you can just put something in the chat and I'll monitor that. But I'll start with the room. If there's anyone in the room that would like to say something.
Thank you. Great presentations, great talk. Thank you for sharing all of that. So back in the Netherlands, where I actually directed with psychiatrists, they would sometimes say, "Oh, I don't like seeing the patients with geography," and that they will still treat them. It was their job to do it, and they will do it. But this would be like to another psychiatrist and so I can't really say anymore. So when someone says that about bipolar disorder, "Oh, I don't like bipolar," sorry, borderline personality, they're trying to manipulate. What do you think about that? Because they might still treat them, they might still do it, but just having this thought in their mind could already affect the
I think that's a good question and like a good parallel to like something like depression. What the norm is with BPD is having that commentary, but then not providing treatment, because the discourse is that they're treatment resistant. So why would I help them? Whereas people with depression, although we know treatment-resistant depression exists, there's hope. We know that there's hope that exists for people with depression and that they'll find like a purpose and find their life worth living again. But this discourse on BPD doesn't exist. I'm trying to work to change that, and I think it's slowly starting to change. But that's the discourse, is that psychiatrists, clinicians, researchers, people in society in general talk about BPD in this context that, well, if they're treatment resistant and they don't respond to treatment, then why would we help them? Which we know that treatments like dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance therapy, psychotherapy, it is proven to help, and in combination with pharmacology, it does work, and there is recovery that's possible. So yes, of course, it's normal to have compassion fatigue and to have that exhaustion that happens when you work with clients with mental health issues. But it's the discourse on like not providing treatment that exists that really is what prevents access to care.
Okay, thank you. So we have a comment in the chat from someone that just is saying that they have a loved one who was recently diagnosed with BPD. It was very hard on our family, but I'm glad we finally know what is wrong. Thanks for your talk. It gives me hope. So I guess I'll follow that up with a question, and keeping in mind that not everyone's experience is the same, but what should people keep in mind if they know someone, whether it's family member or a friend with BPD, what should those people keep in mind, and kind of how can they help in moments of distress?
I think what I can do is talk about my lived experience and what worked for me during that time. And now is having, and I know that's not always the reality of everyone who struggles with BPD, but having someone that was there to validate my emotions. So once my mom and my support system sort of shifted their perspective on mental health in general and understood sort of the implications that it had for my mental health and the consequences of their action, there was this huge like culture shock and shift that happened within my family. And we moved towards like validating my emotions, even if I was freaking out over something as little as getting into a small argument with a friend that became a huge thing to me. It was just like validating, okay, I understand that this is a really big moment for you and a really intense emotion. How can I help you like ride the wave? And so my mom, because I mostly lived with her, really helped me to just like She would make me laugh during these moments. She would find things to help me distract because that was one of the hardest things for me. So my mom would just sometimes sit there in bed with me as I was having a crisis. And I'd be like, what are you doing here? And she'd be like, well, I just want to stay here. I just want to hang out. I'm like, well, now's not the time. And she's like, I'm allowed to stay here. And so she would stay and she would sit. And then after a while, she would crack jokes and I'd start to like really get a slower return to baseline. But I felt like someone was there to listen to me if I wanted to open up. And then I also had space in therapy and access to this type of care that really changed my perspective on BPD, because initially it was led by what I was reading in the media and what I was reading in terms of what I was hearing by my care providers at the time. And there was a shift in like, okay, so it is from, I was like born biologically vulnerable to emotions, and then mixed with like invalidating environments is like created this like emotional and instability within me. So just having that psychoeducation, I think for parents is also really important. And maybe having workshops on like emotion validation and how to regulate emotions could be like really helpful down the line. I don't know if that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, no, it does. So from what I understand, just being present, validating other people's emotions, listening actively, and informing themselves, being more literate in mental health symptoms and care programs. Okay. And there's also Chelsea's documentary that can be shared as well. Any other questions? We have one more there.
So thank you, Chelsea. This was great. I really enjoyed it. Quite deep and moving, and thanks for sharing the entire story. We don't hear the entire story more. You're talking to people some stories of the crisis, and we get really good snapshots of it. But thanks for doing that. I have several thoughts. But one thing that struck me is how we said access to care is a huge issue. And you're right. There's no borderline personality clinics. There's no like emotional distress clinics. They don't run anywhere, and even things like DBT are so unavailable. Very few places have capacity to do this kind of treatment, and they are completely inundated with number of reference issues. So access is a huge issue, and when I think of access, one thing that comes to my mind is when and where the diagnosis gets given to most people who carry the diagnosis. Usually it is in ER, emergency room setting. It's usually in a crisis setting. There is no system in place where we can identify emotional instability in a teenager, in a young person, support them even pre-diagnostically, before a crisis hits. And this is a real problem, because when the crisis eventually hits, people are not equipped, families are not equipped. And the crisis is usually something like what you said, right? Self-harm or like a sort of dissociation, and people then turn to the immediate emergency option, which is usually a hospital, usually an evening, nighttime, weekend, and usually get seen by someone whose main agenda, not with any intentional agenda, but the ER workers' main agenda is to make sure you leave the ER. They don't want you to stay there forever. So the first thing they want to do is give you some sort of explanation for your problem and send you away. And this happens like almost in every case of diagnosis that they experience this issue. So I'm asking a question to you here. Should self-harm be clinical? Should it be a clinical issue? Because traditionally, that's how the society has been treating it. Every time there's a self-harm, the expectation is a clinician has to, deal with their health. Because of that, we turn to hospitals which is very different from, let's say, domestic abuse. It's a completely different problem. Let's say if a husband hits a wife or wife hits a husband, they don't go to the immediately go to the clinic for this kind of issue. But some traditionally, conventionally, have been treated this way, at least in the West. So, is this causing an epidemic of this kind of diagnosis being given? I do think it's getting overdiagnosed. People have found out these personality disorder diagnosis in general quite easily and quite readily as well, quite immediately before having a lifespan. This person went through. It was very useful to see a picture of Marshall Langen's summarizing of two different schools of problem coming together. You had a yin and that's how it is, right? Most of the time, biological and social together. But a lot of social details will not be available. You are saying whatever people get is maybe it's not sure of in the crisis mood what your mom or dad or you were going to say to them. And the ways are the judgments and that. So number one, should self-care be taken away from clinics? Self-harm be
Mhm.
taken away from clinics? And secondly, we missed this point, but I think it's worth bringing it up. There's a lot of gender bias
Mhm.
in all of this.
Mhm.
Personalities over there.
Mhm.
Conventionally, mental health has been lying in the field, in the fight of the last 2 years.
Mhm.
Well, this awareness all the time. And this saw the genderized behavior, the human behavior, a different kind of, different box compared to what they saw the human behavior is. So a lot of this kind of emotional fluctuations, even normal physiological fluctuations, were seen through a pathological lens, and we're given labels like histrionic personality, borderline, so on and so forth. Is that something that we need to, also address in the current setting? And what should we do as peer support groups for this kind of gender issue that prevails in society?
To answer the first question in terms of like self-harm and emergency settings, I think it is because if I'm being fully transparent, I engaged in various different forms of self-harm. And so it wasn't just physical, I also engaged in different forms of self-harm that brought me to the emergency room. I think there needs to be a unit. And so we know that harm reduction exists for drug disorders. In an ideal world, I see harm reduction existing for self-harm. So having units that help reduce self-harm, help have readily accessible like tools that are going to provide like different coping mechanisms for self-harm. For me, it turned out that whenever I wanted to engage in a self-inflicting act, I had to do something that would counteract that emotion. So I would either pull away from the situation and I'd watch TV right away. I was like, but I needed somebody to tell me to do that. I couldn't make that decision by myself. And then if I would go towards something that I would use to harm myself, it would be like, okay, instead use ice or use something that like I would use a pen. So I would physically be doing something to myself, but it wasn't actually inflicting harm. But that was told to me after several weeks of DBT therapy. If we had units that do help self-harm reduction in emergency situations, I think that solves some of the issue. And then, yes, I agree the diagnosis takes time. And so when I came to the Douglas, my mom was here, I was here, they did a developmental interview with my mom. They did a comprehensive interview with me. And so this diagnosis came, but I know that long-term and as a future clinician, it's getting the whole picture. And so when I was reassessed by my current psychologist, I asked her to reevaluate because it was done in an emergency situation. So to provide that full sort of diagnostic interview to really make sure that it is the full picture because it is a hefty diagnosis. And there's a lot of things that I didn't get to talk about in the presentation that I've started to do a lot more research on, like complex trauma and how that may differentiate from BPD and all of these different things. And so I think it's important to have a unit that self-harm is critical to a lot of other mental health issues too. So if we have a unit within the emergency room that specializes in this, because Suicide Watch does not work. It's not an effective sort of response because you're not providing me with any care that I could take home with me. So rerouting somebody into like a care facility, not that's inpatient, but that they're going to receive care as soon as possible, I think is critical. And that doesn't need to be just DBT focused as much as like I'm an advocate for DBT. There's different ways that we could get immediate care because DBT is comprehensive. It's very long. It's usually 12 weeks a program. So having different avenues of care that maybe does start in the emergency room because self-harm is a serious act, and I almost lost my life to an act. And so I think that seriousness needs to be taken seriously, but having a unit within the emergency room, I think that is prepared for self-harm and suicide is critical because it's happening more and more. And so having these, especially in general hospitals, not something like the Douglas, but a general hospital, I think it's really critical because I was just put into a room and they would come and see me every 2 hours and take my vitals. That's not helping me long-term. The gender, I 100% agree, wasn't something I could talk about. And so we know that borderline is more highly diagnosed in females than males. More recent research that I was reading is now we're seeing it kind of slowly balance out. But I don't feel like I'm in a place to actively talk about it because I was a female that received the diagnosis and I was like, okay, I'm just one of the many. And like, as I talk more and more and as I do more and more learning and self-learning and being more self-aware, maybe I had a comorbidity of complex trauma at the same time that was undiscovered. And we didn't know that at the time, 5 years ago, what complex trauma really was. It wasn't a fully formed idea yet in the time that I was receiving care. So it's just like these kinds of things that I was thinking of when you talk. I don't know if that kind of answers.
Yeah, it does,
Okay.
yes. You don't need a mic for others to hear what it's saying, but it's really a useful reflection. One thing happening in the answer to self-harm cases, like harm reduction spots, finding self-harm wounds, maybe which are less medical, more kind of social and family support systems. To be a nice recovery. I'm sure there should be some models and what trying to tested on models who speak on video. The one thing that strikes me, challenging to do is this concept, there is a definition of what right or wrong, there is a definition of what is emotional instability, what is line. These definitions give people some sort of category to work with, to tell you this may be an issue for you, to give you treatment. Of course, we don't want to carry them. It's a bit like our vehicles, like the car we use. We want to use a car to move from one place to the other. We don't carry the car with us inside the house. Right? We leave it.
Yeah.
So diagnosis is like that. And it helps. And we have to leave it at some point.
Yeah.
And carry on with our life. But what strikes me is for crisis, where people seek help, there's no good definition of what a crisis is. What is a crisis moving the course of somebody's borderline trajectory? For each person, it might differ, but I think we should really make good attempts to define that right at the beginning. Early stage of the trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually see that themselves. Is this a crisis? Should I, what
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, I'm going to. So, the first step that we took in therapy was realizing what is it that's triggering my crisis. And so at one point in time, it was time. Like time would trigger a crisis. And what did my crisis look like? Oh, it was because there was uncertainty, and so I would not be able to regulate my emotion that had to deal with the uncertainty. And so my brain would default to I don't want to be here anymore because I didn't know how to regulate my emotion. And so the crisis that arose was a suicidal crisis. That was like kind of my trajectory that happened every time. And so in therapy, my therapist was like, okay, but do you actually not want to be here? Or is it because the experience is too intense right now? And so it was like, at that point, it was like, well, I do want to be here. Like I have a great boyfriend. I have great friends, like my mom, my dad, my step-parents, they're all here to support me. Like I do want to be here, but it's too hard to deal with everything that I'm dealing with. So it was, okay, how do we take DBT skills at this point, because that's what I was doing, to disengage from the emotional experience? It takes practice. It takes a lot of work. And I think that's something that we need to talk about more, is that it does take work. It's not going to happen overnight. I would have to disengage from the experience, which is often the hardest part. But what worked for me was like locking myself in my room and just sitting and like either experiencing the emotion and being like, it's okay. Or I would often put a TV show on, like a sitcom, something that would make me laugh. And it was just like 30 minutes to an hour that I was like, this does not exist anymore. The experience that happened no longer exists. And then when I was ready, I would talk about it with my parents or with my partner, whatever that emotional experiences was, to disengage and to not like ruminate on it, like I kind of talked about before, which is often the hardest part, is disengaging from the intense stimuli that triggered the emotional reaction. But once you identify what's causing the crisis, which for me was inability to like take any emotional stimuli, was okay, now how do we target your ability to like, what's your threshold for emotional stimuli? And now it's grown and grown and grown over time. I still have a threshold, but what am I going to do once I reach that threshold and I break? That's up to me to engage in those behaviors and to engage my support system too. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a couple minutes left if anyone else has a question before we wrap up. I don't think so. The one thing I'm in the chat is that this has been recorded today and it will be up on YouTube on the Douglas Research Center YouTube channel within the next few weeks for review if you want to rewatch it or share it with anyone else. But otherwise, Chelsea, thank you again so much for sharing your experience today and that food for thought. I hope it was helpful for everyone to help you with us here today.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.